So yes, it's an enormous privilege and a source of joy to be present at this webinar with you all in the company of Professor Kass, who I think might be characterized as someone who has a love for the Hebrew Bible, a desire to learn and disseminate its wisdom, and a conviction that our culture is in desperate need of rediscovering the old paths of wisdom. So thank you to Dave, to Craig for the invitation to contribute, and to Professor Kass for agreeing to dialogue with us. So like Dave, I speak as a committee member of the Scripture and Hermeneutics seminar. And as Dave has already indicated, we're continually asking ourselves, how do we read the Bible so that we can discern God's address to us? In the terms of Professor Kass's work on Exodus, how do we read the text to find wisdom? This is the hermeneutic problem. And I should just say right at the beginning, hermeneutic is not a word that Professor Kass uses. And he doesn't particularly engage with the hermeneutic tradition as a philosophical tradition. But actually his approach and his reading is shot through with hermeneutical assumptions and principles, which have just warmed the cockles of many of our hearts. So this is the hermeneutic problem: how to best read and interpret a text across time and space. How do we bridge the gap? How to understand what sort of thing this text is, Exodus. How to make sense of who we are, shaped equally by our culture, our history, and our own life experiences. How, in the end, translate this wisdom into the public square. Time is short, so how does Professor Kass read Exodus? What does his hermeneutic look like? Well, over the past number of weeks, we've enjoyed teasing out this question in our reading group, amongst many other questions. In general terms, as he's already begun to outline to us in his introductory remarks, Professor Kass reads Exodus to discern wisdom, what he calls a philosophical reading. And he says this: it denotes the activity epitomized by Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and their descendants of wholehearted pursuit of the truth about the world and our place within it, in search of guidance for how we are to live, seeking wisdom regarding human life lived well in relation to the whole. And very helpfully, he takes time in his introduction to his book on Exodus to talk about how he reads Exodus. He gives us an insight into some of the assumptions underpinning his reading, some of the principles. Now, the first one, I think, is this, and I love it. I love the simplicity of it: a book for everyone. Against the Guild's preoccupation with source criticism, and so the world behind the text, and perhaps against some rabbinic traditions that look to extract legal principles, for Professor Kass, Exodus is first and foremost a book, so it should be read like a book. This literary reading becomes the basis for a wisdom reading. And as a book, it may be read profitably from outside of a religious tradition. It's entirely legitimate for Exodus to be read philosophically for wisdom, for a deeper understanding of the human condition and human polity. In fact, it's good and right if Exodus is just simply read out of curiosity. That's the first thing, a book for everyone. Secondly, it's a story about one nation, but intended to be heard by all nations. And in another context, I've heard Professor Kass talking about Israel's vocation to be a light to the nations, which I think begins to capture that dynamic of the universal and the particular, something that in Christian tradition we've felt strongly too. The scandal of particularity, that phrase that many of us have struggled with in all sorts of different ways. So human beings live between the parochial details of our lives and then in principle, universal principles of morality and law. As a question for reflection, perhaps, how is it that this parochial story has spoken to the wider world down through the centuries? Thirdly, there's an assumption in Professor Kass's approach in the irreducibly pragmatic nature of the text. And we see this intriguingly in his drawing attention to silences and gaps. He writes, it's precisely the text's sparseness, lacunae, ambiguity, and reticence that invite and require the reader's engagement. And just as an aside, I reflected on how linguists have noted that silence itself can be construed as a speech act, or in politeness theory terms, which is a pragmatic model of language use, a face-threatening act, inviting the reader's participation and imagination in the interpretative task. Fourthly, Professor Kass draws attention to the intrinsic authority of the text. He explains that Exodus possesses a persuasive power in itself. There is a sovereignty and a power to this text. It needs no intermediaries. He writes this, access to the truths it might contain does not require prior faith, prior traditional or religious commitments, or reliance on outside authorities. Sounds very Protestant. And I like this, a book that someone must have read before there were any commentaries should be approachable without intermediaries. Fifthly, Professor Kass, and I think Paul Ricoeur would approve, urges an initial hermeneutic of innocence, or what he calls a naive reading of the text. And he explains it like this, I force myself to read it as for the first time, ignorant of what happens later in the story, so as not to distort what is taking place before my eyes. So there's also an engagement here, I think, with the imagination, which we've just touched on. Professor Kass imagines himself there, and I can't help but be struck by a close affinity here with what the Christian tradition calls lectio divina, or an Ignatian spirituality of reading. Who am I in the crowd? Where am I? What does it feel like? What's the temperature like? Am I nervous? Am I excited? All those sorts of questions that when we engage our imagination, we can begin to engage the text in a much more deep and existential way. So this might also share points of contact with what the Oxford philosopher Donald Evans and more recently Richard Briggs have called the logic of self-involvement. As Professor Kass has said, his book on Exodus the book of Exodus aims not just to teach about, but to be lived with. Sixthly, Professor Kass also urges what we might call a hermeneutic of humility. He says, approach the book in a spirit that is simultaneously naive, philosophical, modest, and reverent. Humility before mystery and knowledge of one's own ignorance are hardly at odds with a philosophical spirit. Seventh, there's no conflict with science. Different applications of human reason, that's all. And again, Professor Kass in the preface writes this, I satisfied myself that there's no conflict between the Bible rightly read and modern science, and I was moved to new postures of gratitude, awe, and moral attention. So that the Bible, even though it's on its own terms, it's very critical of unaided human speech and reason. There's a sort of paradox here. On the one hand, humans are presented as not able really to fully comprehend the things of God and the big things, big mysteries of the world. At the same time, part of our being made in the image of God is to be able to apprehend intelligible speech. and, as Professor Kass says, in a most powerful way. The assumption of common anthropology. Hermeneutics has often struggled with this idea that, well, gosh, we live so long away from these events. How can we possibly relate to them? And I think it's helpful that there's an implied common anthropology at work in Professor Kass's reading, that the people who left Egypt are not very different to who we are. So that with, and this is a quote, with some effort of imagination and sympathy, we can live with Moses at the burning bush. We can try to understand them as they understood themselves. He writes, "I have come to regard myself as an integral participant of the book. I'm not a character in the story, but my vicarious participation is required for the text to come fully to life." Final couple of points, and Dave, I think you've already mentioned these, so I won't spend any time on them. First, that in the years that Professor Kass has been writing this commentary on Exodus, as with his experience of writing his commentary on Genesis, it came out of a class of students, of engaged, interested students. And so the fruits of this commentary, I think in part, I'm sure, and I'd love to hear Professor Kass talk more about this, that this has been a communal enterprise, taught and discussed with students over an extended period of time. And I think, Professor Kass, you would say that you at times have learned a great deal from some of the observations of your students. And then just finally, in terms of, this is a very obvious point, and Dave, I think, has already made it, is that there's an interdisciplinary approach being brought to bear on the text. I know for Professor Kass, he had questions about political philosophy when he first approached the text. And the richness of bringing into the conversation the questions of the different disciplines just draws our attention to the richness of the way in which this text of Exodus speaks to us. So I want to conclude just by, these are my own sort of reflections, but I was thinking that there's something of a theology from below in Professor Kass's approach, because what happens, he starts with philosophy, starts for the search for wisdom, he starts as the curious reader, and bit by bit, he's drawn in to a world, a strange world, but a world that begins to transform his own horizons. But I was thinking of Wittgenstein's method, a descriptive anthropology that seeks to answer larger philosophical puzzles by paying close attention to the particular, the local, the parochial, the language game or form of life that's in view. Anthropology provides us with rich insights for understanding the human condition, as well as appreciating the momentous task of re-educating or reforming our given anthropological makeup. Professor Kass has said that getting the enslaved out of Egypt was comparatively easy when put next to the task of getting Egypt out of Israel. It's not always easy for those of us who read with the lens of our own tradition. And call to mind Wittgenstein's own words, one thinks that one is tracing the outline of the thing's nature, and one is merely tracing round the frame through which we look at it. A picture held us captive, and we could not get outside it, for it lay in our language, and language seemed to repeat it to us inexorably. As Anthony Thistleton notes, fresh vision can come only when we're able to reverse certain habits of thinking which are perpetuated by the ways in which we use language. A philosophical reading for wisdom draws us into the mystery of divine agency. What's fascinating about the journey that Professor Kass takes us on is that we ultimately cannot detach the theological from the philosophical, even if we wanted to, without doing serious violence to the text, because the wisdom arises precisely from the synergy between the human agency and anthropology, reason, political mission, and divine agency of the name. Now, a few words about God is one of the final parts of Professor Kass's introduction. I've already mentioned this idea of a theology from below in the spirit of Pannenberg, or even Thistleton for that matter. And I've only got time just to mention these things, and it may be that we get a chance to hear more about them later. The first thing is on theological speculation, the correct way to know God. So when Moses questions God at the burning bush, God says, "I will be what I will be." And Professor Kass suggests maybe we shouldn't ask for God's being or essence, or even about God's existence or his personhood, but rather pay attention to what God says and does. And he writes that according to the text, is the way of coming to know the character who is variously called God or the Lord. Secondly, prayer. Professor Kass encourages us to suspend disbelief. We should pay close and careful attention. We should open ourselves to seeing and hearing what the text has to show and tell us. And I couldn't help but think of how prayer might do that for us. And I saw a grace motif in this idea of finding ourselves thrown into the world, mensch, to live in search of an intelligible and order-creating summons. Professor Kass says it is to recognize that we are here not by choice or merit, but as an undeserved gift from powers not at our disposal. And that this realization of grace actually is the impulse and the inspiration for us to live a life worth living. And then just to name these, because I've run out of time, but the reconfiguration of time and what that might say to us about tradition. And then finally, and maybe most tantalizingly for me, the Holy Spirit, or the spirit of hermeneutics. And I note the phrase, the finger of God. The finger of God is mentioned in Exodus 8. So during the discussions with Pharaoh, the finger of God is what writes the law on the stone tablets. And then, of course, there's Bezalel in the making of the tabernacle, and he receives the Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, the divine Spirit. I'd love to hear more about that. So Professor Kass, I haven't even got time to finish with your own words, which I wanted to finish this presentation with, but thank you so much for your very, very rich reading of this book.